My own sense is that the politics on this are going to get worse for the president because the midterms are coming up. What is it? It's February, so the midterms are coming up in 9 months. At some point, the damage is going to be so bad that the president is going to need to get out in front of it and really make some kind of statement. And I wonder if that's where we're going for, because if we're still talking about this come the summer, it's just going to make the fall, the coming bloodbath, even worse.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Maddie Hale. We're going to start off with Epstein and move into some geopolitics today. So I'm bringing in my guest, Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Bob, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report again.
Thanks for having me.
We'll start off with these words from Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace. I want your thoughts on what she really means behind this. So she's been blasting the DOJ's handling of the Epstein files released despite going against her own boss, Donald Trump. So here's what she tweeted last night. She said, "We are prepared to go full-blown scorched earth for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and his friends, with no regard to our personal or professional detriment. This is about moral clarity. We will burn every bridge, fight every battle, and expose every name necessary to get justice for the survivors. No compromise, no backing down." So I wonder, Bob, is Nancy Mace sending a stern message to Donald Trump that she doesn't care if he tries to ruin her career, the way he's been trying to do with Thomas Massey, for instance, who is up for re-election this year? He's been urging people to vote for his opponent. We know Donald Trump, if you go against him in his own party, he says there will be repercussions, but this seems like a stern message.
Yeah, I imagine there will be repercussions. Donald Trump is pretty known for that kind of ruthlessness, for insisting on absolute loyalty. My own sense politically for Mace is that I believe she's running for governor, right? If she doesn't get elected, she probably will no longer have a political career. She'll be out of the House of Representatives. And I think she probably sees this as a turning point. And so she's going for broke because, if she doesn't get it, she's out of the House, she's not in the governorship, and then she'll go off and do something else and become a lobbyist or something like that. But my understanding is that, this is a big turning point in her career. Certainly that's the way she's discussed it in public. And so I would imagine doubling down on Epstein, which has been something she's emphasized in the past too, right? I would imagine that she sees that as a way to sort of survive both the primary and win in the general. To be a little bit less cynical about it, Mace has also apparently, I don't know too much about her background, but she has claimed publicly that she has been sexually assaulted herself. And so it sounds like this is something that really means something to her personally, right? And we've seen that before with other people advocating for the release. And I think generally speaking, and sort of beyond that, I think she's got, broadly speaking, public opinion behind her, right? I mean, it's very odd. You and I have discussed this a bit. It's very odd that MAGA insisted on like these conspiracies around Epstein and cabals and stuff like that, for a long time, up until about a year and a half ago, maybe like 15 months ago. This was like a big thing on the right. And all of a sudden it's kind of disappeared. And, Elon Musk, of course, famously said on Twitter, it's because Trump is in the Epstein files. But I mean, there is a lot of inertia on the right to push this through. And Mace is actually more in tune with, I think, where the American right was just a year ago. And it's Trump who's out of the step. And it's kind of like this interesting contest. Can Trump kind of like rewrite history to make it look like the Republicans don't actually care that much about Epstein when in fact it was a really, really big issue. Vice President Vance was talking about this as late as a year ago. And so, it's this weird kind of, we've seen this in the last couple months, right, where you have some dissident Republicans who are starting to break with the president, right? This is a very, very electric issue. It really mobilizes people, the perception that sort of powerful men were abusing younger girls. And so, I think that's what's driving it, right? Mace is kind of, she's sort of going her own way now. She's sort of plowing her own path because she wants to be governor, and this is an issue that's really important to her. And the president just apparently doesn't have the clout in his party he had before.
And a lot of these people, Republicans and MAGA voters who are coming out and basically won't give up on the Epstein files, aren't actually saying that Trump himself have done anything wrong. No one's coming out saying there's evidence against Trump. It's just that more they're saying that if you're rich and powerful and you're in these Epstein files, there should be some accountability. There should be some investigations. But we talk about how, this is impacting his own constituents. And I want to get your thoughts on what Joe Rogan said about this, Bob, because he was criticizing the way that the Trump administration has handled the files. He said that the files scare him. So he said, literally demonic human beings that are running the world and don't give a about human lives. It's so sick, it's so twisted, it's disgusting, and everybody wants to think that it's not happening now. This is definitely not a hoax. And if you redact people's names and these people aren't victims, you are not protecting the victims. So, I mean, time and time again, especially the last few weeks, we are seeing that the Epstein files really defy this political aisle for even the staunchest of Trump supporters.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I think that's because of the sort of electric, highly charged quality of this, right? And the perception that sort of like women as young as like 12 or something like that may have been sexually abused by men, powerful men. I mean, that really strikes a chord. I mean, anyone who's got kids is going to be immediately, terrified about that. And again, this is something that QAnon and the American right and MAGA really emphasized for a good 4 or 5 years there. And it's very strange that this has suddenly been dropped, right? And so if you're a politician who's been elected and you need Donald Trump to help you get through a primary, you're willing to suddenly turn the volume down, right? We've seen that, I think, with Speaker Johnson, who suddenly dropped this. All of a sudden, JD Vance isn't. But if you're an outside Republican influencer, if you're a MAGA influence on the outside like Joe Rogan, right, your career isn't necessarily as closely tied. And so Rogan, like Vance in the same way, or like Mace in the same way that she's moving away from MAGA because she's running for the governorship, both of them have some room to kind of freelance. And given the highly charged personal and emotional quality of this issue, right, this is the kind of area where you would expect to see that, right? Joe Rogan's not going to break with Donald Trump over, like, the capital gains tax, right? I mean, something like this, right, which really mobilizes people's deeply felt personal beliefs, right? And so, I think there's some room here, emotionally, personally, for MAGA dissidents, right? And we saw it with Marjorie Taylor Greene, too, right? Right, where, people who really feel strongly about this have some space to kind of push the president. And, we just don't know. And it's very curious, actually, because we've not actually seen serious fissures in MAGA before, right? I mean, that's why everybody's paying attention to this so much politically, right? Because we're all kind of wondering if there's ever like a bottom or a break point with MAGA where people would start to break off. And this might be it. I wonder.
Yeah, I do think that is it, because Trump seems to kind of, claw his way back from whatever he gets himself involved in, whether it be striking Iran. I know that a lot of Republicans were anti that because, of course, a lot of his base are very anti-US involvement in other conflicts around the world, especially if it leads to boots on the ground. But the Epstein mishandling does seem to be, the thing that keeps people hooked. And on that note, I want to read out a quote. Another quote on Twitter, Bob. This is an interesting post by an American businessman, conservative media personality, Patrick David. This is what he said. He said, the Epstein files has become the biggest black eye for this administration. There are very few issues that unite Americans across politics, religion, and income levels. Protecting kids is one of them. The last 3 administrations failed to address it. This was an opportunity to finally confront it head on. The attack, deny, never apologize playbook doesn't work when children are involved. He said, yes, there's a lot to celebrate. Murder is down 20%, border more secure, America protecting strength, markets doing well, but none of that matters to parents if kids aren't protected. It's all true. Many on the left are more focused on taking down Trump than protecting children. Otherwise, this would have been a priority years ago. Still, this has been badly mishandled. When it comes to kids, transparency and accountability aren't optional. Major fumble, no other way to say. And then, of course, in conjunction with this, Bob, Vanity Fair writes, Epstein has effectively risen from the dead to dominate Trump's presidency and threaten his legacy. Trump can start wars, deploy troops, manufacture crises, but none of it shakes Epstein loose. No dog Trump wags barks loud enough. Epstein may be dead, but in Trump's White House, he is the one with the bone. I mean, these are two very interesting takes about how this will impact not only his administration right now, but his legacy.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's broadly accurate. I mean, again, the sort of emotional quality of the issue, sexual assault of children, is just so electric. It's just so, it hits so hard. I mean, lots of people are parents and have their own daughters and think, I mean, I just don't know if Trump can escape this. To that, I would add the fact that emphasizing the idea of Epstein as like this kind of conspiracy and like this unique covered class that had special favors. That was something that was really important for Trump's voters for a very long time, right? It was the American right that really kind of turned this into a big political issue as opposed to a law enforcement one. And so I think that's why I think it's been so difficult for the president to drop it. And, I think the cynical suspicion is Musk's claim from a year ago that the president doesn't want it because he's in there. That's not been verified yet. My own sense is that the politics on this are going to get worse for the president because the midterms are coming up. What is it? It's February, so the midterms are coming up in 9 months, right? If we're still talking about this, if Rogan is still going rogue on this, and Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson or whatever, come the summer, that's going to be a real problem, right? The Republicans are already looking at a really bad election in the fall, and I just wonder if this thing turns into this constant drip feed of, like every other week there's like some weird thing, like yesterday with Pam Bondi refusing to look at the victims and stuff like that, and that's all over TV, and we're talking about that, it's all over Twitter. I don't know, at some point the damage is going to be so bad that the president is going to need to get out in front of it and really make some kind of statement, and I wonder if that's where we're going for, because if we're still talking about this come the summer, it's just going to make the fall, the coming bloodbath, even worse.
Yeah, and it is true in this deny, never apologize playbook that has worked for Trump. That is the takeaway, that it is interesting that this is not working for him. We're going to move on to what's kind of making waves across the globe, Bob. So according to the Russian embassy in Havana, Russia is expected to send oil and petroleum products to Cuba as humanitarian aid. This is because Cuba is currently amid a severe energy crisis, the worst in years, triggered by the US choking off supplies of Venezuelan oil. So the Kremlin accused the US of trying to suffocate Cuba with these pressures. But I mean, what is your reaction to this, I guess, irony?
Yeah, well, first of all, I do think that the Trump administration is significantly more comfortable using force post-Maduro than before, right? I mean, the idea that MAGA was isolationist, that was reasonably credible last year, but all of a sudden there's been this really sharp U-turn. It's very characteristic of Trump, right? That he just makes these big policy U-turns. And so here we are now after post-Maduro. It's like the Americans are going to, sort of be, difficult and belligerent in the Western Hemisphere and stuff. And so I think the perception that Cuba is vulnerable to regime pressure and eventual regime collapse, that's something that conservatives have wanted since like the 70s. I mean, I remember that when I was a kid. That's something that's been in Republican politics for a long time, right? And we know that Cuban Americans in the United States are forced in conservative politics, Marco Rubio and all that. Okay. And so to the extent that Trump has sort of taken the gloves off and said, okay, well, now when MAGA's not so isolationist anymore, my guess is that Rubio's like, okay, now we can hit Cuba. And Cuba's obviously pretty weak, right? I mean, Castro's gone. There's no ideological legitimacy anymore. The country's broke. So, and I think, but if you're the Russians, I think you're looking around and you're worried that like the Americans are picking off your allies and partners out there, right? Maduro's gone. The Americans have bombed Iran, right? Syria's gone. Cuba. I mean, it's part of sort of Putin's conception that Russia is like this great global power of influence, is that it has sort of friends around the world, and it's proven conspicuous that Putin actually can't rescue his friends, right? I mean, you hear these stories about how Assad is now in Moscow playing video games. He's on an Xbox all day because the Russians couldn't help him. I mean, that's what's going to happen to Cuba. And so I think I think there's some concern here, right? But I mean, the Russians are in a really tight spot. I've talked about this many times. They're trapped in a quagmire, right? Or Ukraine has turned into Vietnam. The Russians don't know how to win, right? They just don't have the resources to bail out their friends. I mean, if I were the Cubans, actually, I'd be looking to the Chinese, who might actually have that ability. But I'm not sure if the Chinese are going to bother to contest the Americans for something that's so close to the U.S. homeland. So I think that's why Putin's doing it. I don't think Putin cares about Cuba. I think it's this perception that Russia has geopolitical reach, which the Trump administration, ironically, given how much Trump likes Putin, Trump has actually really proven just how weak Putin is outside of Eastern Europe.
But Bob, when you have Putin's government, accusing Trump's government of immorality, especially when it comes to a nation's oil supply, as Russia continues to target Ukraine's energy, literally,
Right, yeah.
broke a 1 week ceasefire that Trump told him to respect, which of course he didn't. How do you think Trump should be responding to this? Because I mean, to accuse the US of suffocating Cuba, to also be targeting Ukraine's energy, while kind of, stringing the United States along for a ride when it comes to this 1 week ceasefire of attacking Ukraine's energy, it's a bit of a slap in the face.
Yeah, I think it is. And Putin is entirely opportunistic and cynical, which is something that you and I have discussed before. And I think everyone outside the Trump White House sees that. I'm personally sort of amazed that the president continues to be sort of bedazzled by Putin. That's where you got all these theories that, well, Putin's got compromise on Trump, that he's got a picture of him with a girl or something like that. But I mean, we know this. I mean, Trump has been making apologies for Vladimir Putin for a long time, and were Trump to take suddenly a hard line over one of these things, it would sort of suggest that Trump had made mistakes in the past. Trump doesn't like ever admitting error, and so to a certain extent, he's tied himself to Putin, which is why I think he continues to apologize for him, right? Trump pretty obviously admires him. My own sense is that Putin probably does actually have something on Trump, either sexual or financial. Maybe Trump got some kind of payoff back in the day. So my sense is that Trump will probably never turn on Putin. I'm not really sure if there's anything that could cause that break. But it is kind of the irony of that, I think, is that despite that rhetorical subservience almost sometimes to Putin, is the reality that the American administration, Trump's administration, his behavior is actually outside of Ukraine actually isn't quite that accommodating of the Russians, right? I mean, the Americans again keep picking off Russian clients and small partners, and that's again I think that's what's getting the response on Cuba. And the Trump people just won't listen on Cuba. Marco Rubio is not going to listen to Vladimir Putin on Cuba.
Meanwhile, Russia has reportedly drafted an internal memo outlining potential economic reset with the US, including energy corporation, a minerals deal, possibly sanctions relief tied to ending the Ukraine war. So the proposal suggests that Moscow believes that Trump could also reopen dollar trade and restore broader economic ties if a political settlement is reached. But is this political, a potential economic partnership good enough for the US that Trump would favor it over Ukraine's safety, over its sovereignty?
I think the president himself would like to go for that, right? I mean, Trump is personally committed to Putin at this point. Doubling, turning back on that would mean an admission of error, which Trump's not going to do. The problem is that a fair amount, Trump would have to get congressional buy-in to get these things. I mean, unless Trump goes full authoritarian, which I guess is a possibility. But, in the normal American structure, Trump would have to get some kind of congressional buy-in, and Congress is just not going to agree to anything, that actually recognizes Russia's conquest of eastern Ukraine, that gives Putin some kind of sweetheart deal, right? Again and again, Putin has tried to go to Trump and to Witkoff and Kushner because he gets a better deal out of them. But then he collides with the rest of the Western community. He collides with the American foreign policy community, with the State Department, with the Defense Department, Congress, all of which are really, really skeptical about Trump and Putin. And so, Putin, Trump can agree to something, but according to the Constitution, any kind of a treaty has to be both, signed by the executive but ratified by the legislature. And I just don't know if Trump can actually get anything out of Congress on Russia. Perhaps MAGA can, Trump can really twist Congress arm. But I don't know. I mean, Putin would have to offer some fantastic deal, and I just don't know if Putin has the resources to do that anymore. So, I just don't know. I mean, maybe Putin can buy off Trump, but I just don't think I don't think he's got the wherewithal to get Congress to buy in. So I'm pretty skeptical. And we've heard this kind of stuff from Trump before, right? I mean, I believe you and I were talking about like rare earths coming out of Ukraine and stuff like that, and sort of, Witkoff will say, oh, we had these big deals with the Russians. And that stuff has fallen through again and again and again and again. My own sense is that the Ukraine war is fairly persistent, that it's really, really difficult to get a deal because the two sides are very far apart. And Trump is kind of clouding the issue with a lot of rhetoric, but he never actually delivers. So maybe we'll get something, but I'm pretty skeptical.
Also, Bob, this weekend will be a big weekend. European leaders, the US, are all gathering in Munich for the Security Conference. President Zelensky, in the lead up to the conference, he announced that Ukraine will receive $38 million in military aid from international allies for 2026. However, he also said that he will not present a bad deal to end the war for a referendum, and that an election in Ukraine will only be held if security guarantees and a ceasefire is broken. So I wonder, I mean, we've gone back and forth over this. He agreed to Trump that yes, he'll do an election, but there are procedures in place before that happens. I mean, how likely is it that we could get that over the line?
I'm really, really skeptical. Again, you and I have discussed this so often, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that the core issue is Putin's war goals. That until Putin is willing to accept that he's not going to be able to conquer Ukraine, that what he has now is the most he's ever going to get. Right? He can keep kind of grinding forward and taking a couple hundred kilometers every 6 months or something like that. But unless Putin is willing to fight this war for like another 15 years or something, like Vietnam style, he's not going to win, and the cost of that to the Russian economy and Russia's reputation would just be dramatic. So I think that's what that's what Zelensky is saying here, right? That the Russians really can't win this thing, and there's no particular reason why the Ukrainians should make major concessions unless they're going to get major counter concessions. The elections are one of those concessions, right? We know Trump wants that, but I'm not sure the Americans actually have the leverage to actually get the Ukrainians to do this anymore, right? I mean, if you actually sort of look at the aid that's going to Ukraine, almost all of it is coming from Europe now. The Americans are making the Europeans pay for the weapons. I mean, actually, Trump loves to talk about leverage. The Americans have actually given away their leverage over Ukraine because they're not actually helping Ukraine financially very much anymore. Most of what we're providing is intelligence and some logistics. right? And the Ukrainians increasingly can get that from the French. And so, I'm actually not sure if Trump can actually twist the arm of the Ukrainians. At this point, Zelensky might just be like, hey, we don't have to listen to you because you're not paying anymore, right? And so, Trump is in a tight spot. It's just, I would argue that after 15 months of Trump trying to deliver with Witkoff and the rest, that Trump can't do it. It's just not going to happen, right? The Russians have got to make the Ukrainians some kind of offer that the Ukrainian public, at least a significant chunk of it, can live with, right? And that would mean some kind of non-aggression agreement or like a demilitarization of what's been conquered. And it's got to be something. If the Russian response is just, more, then the Ukrainians are going to say no, right? I mean, that's where we've been for the last several years since peace talks really began a few years ago. And I just don't see that much change. Again, I think Trump clouds the issue a lot of sort of posturing and Witkoff and whatever, and everybody gets excited, but then it falls through again and again and again. And so until the Russians are willing to offer something the Ukrainians can actually take to their public, that Zelensky can take to the public, and the public might agree to, right? I just don't see this happening.
Bob, just a final question. What are your expectations for this weekend at the Munich Security Conference? Of course, right now, NATO does seem to be at a crossroad. Marco Rubio is attending. He is set to have a private meeting today with the Danish PM. Of course, that could have a bit of tension. And this is, of course, coming off the back from last year where JD Vance went to the Munich Security Conference, delivered a highly controversial speech where he criticised EU allies over their censorship, immigration policies, insinuated that they are a bigger security threat than Russia and China. But the VP won't be going this year. But I guess, do you think international allies will be on high alert, or is it a bit softer, a bit less worrisome with Marco Rubio there?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And, Rubio broadly believes in alliances, right? I mean, Rubio is a MAGA guy only kind of by political ambition, I think, rather than not conviction, which is to say that Marco Rubio has wanted to be Secretary of State for a long time, and Trump was his route to that position. But I don't think that Marco Rubio actually wants to see the U.S. withdraw from NATO or South Korea or any of those kinds of things that the Trump people have talked about. I think, Rubio really kept his head down during the Greenland mess because it's pretty clear that Rubio didn't think it was a good idea, right? I don't think we'll be coming back to that. I think there's an increasing amount of circumstantial evidence that the reason we the Americans backed off on Greenland was because the Europeans were dumping treasuries, right? The most important thing for Donald Trump going forward financially is to keep the U.S. interest rate on the 10-year close to 4%, right? And we just cannot afford all this debt. And so that got Trump to back off. And so, my guess is that we won't be talking about Greenland again, not because Trump's ambitions have changed, but because the financing isn't there. And Rubio will recognize that and be more conciliatory. I think the longer term question is whether or not the United States would actually meaningfully intervene for European security under this administration. I think the answer is no. And so Rubio, will say nice things. He'll be better than Vance. But I think the larger story, and we've seen that with, the discussion around Rutte in the last few weeks, the larger story is, can Europe afford its own defense? What would it buy? Can it work together as a bloc instead of having individual countries like Germany going off and doing it on their own? I think that's really probably what's being discussed behind the scenes, right? That, okay, at least American predation is over. The Americans aren't going to attack us now. That's progress. But, they're not actually going to come and fight for us, so we got to go and do our own thing. And again, I think the weird part of that, MAG is going to celebrate that as a victory, right? We're not paying for European defense anymore. But, it does actually reduce American leverage in Europe, right? If Donald Trump really wants to twist Zelensky's arm into some kind of deal on Russia, the Americans don't have the leverage for that anymore. If the Europeans are doing their own thing, they don't have to listen to us anymore. If the Americans aren't helping the Ukrainians anymore on financing for the war, then Zelensky doesn't have to listen to us anymore. Trump has kind of painted himself into a corner where the only thing keeping the Americans relevant is inertia, is that the Americans have always been important for security, and so everybody's instinct is to go back to Washington. But the United States is actually sort of like thinning its own ground for relevance here, because it looks like the Trump people want to disengage and talk about, Iran or China or whatever. And I wonder if the Trump people grasp that. My guess is Rubio does, but I don't know if the president understands that he's actually losing leverage he loves to claim so much.
Well, we'll see what happens over this weekend, and if the US digs itself into another hole. Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining the Chat Report.
Thanks for having me, Maddie. Always a pleasure.